As an Israeli and as a Jew, how are you feeling at this moment in Israeli history? From 1840, this is 18 Questions, 40 Israeli Thinkers, and I'm your host, Sroli Fruchter. 18 Questions, 40 Israeli Thinkers is a podcast that interviews Israel's leading voices to explore those critical questions people are having today on Zionism, the Israel-Hamas war, democracy, morality, Judaism, peace, Israel's future, and so much more. Every week, we introduce you to fresh perspectives and challenging ideas about Israel from across the political spectrum that you won't find anywhere else. So if you're the kind of person who wants to learn, understand, and dive deeper into Israel, then join us on our journey as we pose 18 pressing questions to the 40 Israeli journalists, scholars, and religious thinkers you need to hear from today. By the time you're listening to this, it's been 1 year since October 7th. One of those dates that a few years ago had no significance and now will be one that haunts everybody in different ways. I moved to Israel a little over a year ago in August of 2023, and being here with Israel during this year has been very strange. I'm feeling very unmoored, disoriented, with this strange sense of sorrow that never seems to end and always seems to be lurking in the background. Ernest Becker wrote this book called The Denial of Death in, I believe, the 1970s. And one of the things he writes about is that the reality of life, the fragility of our own lives and of our own mortality is too much for people to handle. And in general, the way people deal with that is that we, in some ways, create illusions for our lives. And we can get so lost in the individual details of our lives, our job, our relationships, and so on, to almost think of ourselves as immortal, to forget that we are one tragedy, one accident away from a final fate. And not to be so grim, but I do feel like, at least for myself and at least for what I see in Israel, this year has kept us frozen in a way, frozen in that same space that people find themselves in when there's a close death to someone they know, to a loved one. And suddenly everything they thought was important about life suddenly starts to fade and dissipate a little bit. And they're left with the residues of a reality that is very unforgiving. Death is unforgiving. Death is very final. And I feel like the brutality of October 7th itself, with 1,200 massacred by Hamas, hundreds of fallen IDF soldiers since October 7th, and the remaining 101 hostages, at least as of this recording, still trapped in Gaza, has been part of what's left over when the illusion of our lives have gone away. And for Israelis, I think that this is always, in some sense, hovering in the background, always aware of an existential danger that's lurking just beyond the borders in neighboring countries and in not so neighboring countries. I mean, even now, I'm recording this on Erev Rosh Hashanah on October 2nd, I believe. Last night, we were just in bomb shelters from an Iranian attack. And I always find that there's this strange juxtaposition or paradox between when people from the States will reach out to me and ask how everyone's doing, if people are nervous. And of course, in the moment, things are always very scary, but then you walk out afterward and people are going shopping and they're talking and they're getting coffee. And there's this sense of normalcy that almost needs to persist despite all of the horror and danger that surrounds us. Part of the reason why we started 18 Questions, 40 Israeli Thinkers was partially because we had this model for a different podcast, 18 Questions, 40 Jewish Thinkers. But over the last few months, we were talking as a team and trying to think, how do we meet the moment and how do we, while still staying true to what 1840 is, prepared for those larger questions on Jewish life in the modern day? How do we not remain obtuse and how do we still give attention and meet the moment of Israel and of Jewry overall? And 18 Questions, 40 Israeli Thinkers, as we've said before, is trying to platform those different kinds of voices in Israeli society to get a more intimate introduction into the discourse and the discussion and the dialogue that is taking place between the thinkers of Israel today. And the first question that we always ask in every single interview is, as an Israeli and as a Jew, how are you feeling at this moment in Israeli history? I heard that question in some variation asked to Yair Lapid, the opposition leader, in a New York Times interview, I believe in December. It was how the interviewer started off. It's for the New York Times' The Interview series, not that I'm trying to promote a different podcast. But I was very intrigued in how the framing of the question was able to peel back a layer for the guest before them. And so for this week's episode, I want to revisit the voices and the perspectives of our 14 Israeli thinkers thus far to give us an interesting way of thinking about October 7th and being present on this day and understanding and connecting to that ongoing sense of pain in our lives and in the lives of Israelis. The reason that this question intrigues me so much is for something that I've read Franz Rosenzweig say in a separate book by Eric Santner. And Rosenzweig was someone who at one point was a fervent academic and then kind of had like a roundabout in which he became much more focused on the quote unquote real elements of life. And I'm going to read this quote very briefly to try and explain what I mean. There is a man in each scholar, a man who inquires and stands in need of answers. I am anxious to answer the scholar qua man, but not the representative of a certain discipline, that insatiable, ever-inquisitive phantom, which like a vampire drains him who it possesses of his humanity. I hate that phantom as I do all phantoms. Its questions are meaningless to me. What Rosenzweig is trying to say here is that there is a type of curiosity and engagement with other people that is purely intellectual, that is blocked off from the courtyards of life, from the real human experiences, where we talk about trauma, we talk about fear, we talk about a country under existential peril, but we block off our feelings from entering the conversation. And what he's saying here is that I'm not interested in just talking to someone about some abstract intellectual conversation. I want to meet the man. I want to meet the person. I don't want to meet just the scholar. And I really resonate with that. And I think it's an important introduction for today's episode, because I think that there is a world where we talk about October 7th and the horror of it in terms of a historical, political, philosophical realm, or even a spiritual, religious realm. But I think on days of mourning, on days when we're really leaning into the dark shadows of what came in the past. And in this case, it's not even over. It's not even like October 7th. It's just a date that, or a trauma that happened, or a tragedy that happened, or a terrorist attack that happened. It's ongoing. There's still the war against Hamas. There are new wars against Lebanon, against Iran. And there are over 100 hostages still trapped in Gaza, many of whom are believed to be dead. And that makes this all the more difficult. There's a new book that Koren just published. It was translated into English. It's called One Day in October, I believe by Toby Press. It's called One Day in October by Yair Agmon and Oria Mevorach. One Day in October, 40 Heroes, 40 Stories. And it's truly a wonderful project, a phenomenal book. It was very, very popular in the original Hebrew when it was published. And I want to read a very brief excerpt and a very brief story from one of the 40 people the book platforms. Her name is Or Ben Yehuda, commander of a battalion whose mother was awarded while fighting in the Yom Kippur War. And after I read this, I want to then move in to think about our guests and to hear from them. This is Or's recollection of an experience from October 7th. She writes, I remember the situation so clearly. I peer, lift my head up, then bring my head back down, then look to the side again. Some 5 pickup trucks are coming at me, and packs of motorcyclists, and terrorists are hopping between the dunes, between the trees, all in combat vests and uniforms and advancing in our direction. I can't even count them. There are hundreds. And in the distance behind them are long lines of people from Gaza who are just marching in our direction. Some armed, some unarmed. And I say to myself, well, that's it. This is where I'm going to die. Right here on this spot. I'm going to die here. I've been in many encounters and many firefights in my life, but it never felt like this. It never even came close to this. This time I accepted death. I came to terms with death. I understood that's how it is. I remember looking up and apologizing to my children. In my heart, I begged them to forgive me. They're so little and so cute, and I'd never come back to them, never see them again. That was it. I saw this was really the end. And then I said to myself, okay, if this actually is the end, then I'll end it well. I'll die standing tall. I'll do the very best I can, and I'll fight until my last drop of blood. So I turned to my soldiers, a group of 12 brave fighters who were waiting for me to tell them what to do. I turned to them with a half smile. They told me afterward that I smiled, but I don't remember it. And I say to them, let's go, let's take them apart. And they all shout, let's do it. They come to the embankment with heavy machine guns, with whatever they can carry. And we take our place there and start shooting at anyone approaching the outpost. We shoot like crazy people, and at a certain point, we have a light anti-tank missile. So at one point, we launch it toward one of the Hamas trucks, and the truck explodes. A tremendous explosion. Something extreme. The truck must have been loaded with explosives, and the blast takes with it some motorcyclists who were nearby. As we continue fighting, I suddenly realize that many of the terrorists are beginning to retreat, to turn around and run back. And I suddenly understand that we are, in fact, doing something significant here. There were a few different excerpts that I could have chosen to read from. The reason I chose this one is because I think it's a very short snapshot, spanning however many minutes, in a day that felt endless. And so now as we begin to hear from our guests, and I'll give introductions to each guest a bit, to preface what they're saying, I want to note that there were, as you might expect, many different experiences of how each of our guests were doing. Obviously, they were all talking at different times. I mean, roughly this is between June and September. So it's not like there's been anything that's so drastic that's happened. Of course, there are different updates and things are always changing quite quickly. But I found that there were generally three kinds of responses, at least how I would categorize them. There were many people who leaned into fear and sorrow, which I definitely feel personally is more where I'm inclined, given the fact that the shadow doesn't seem to be eclipsed by sunlight because it just continuously is ongoing. Then there were those who adopted a sort of confidence of like, no, everything is okay. And of course, things are terrible. Strange little paradox there. But the terrible is what the Jews are used to, so we're going to be fine. And it was very matter of fact. And then still, there were others who had more of a sense of hope, who saw a greater future, a greater potential that would survive after all of the hardship and anguish that continues to define the lives of Israelis and the lives of Jews worldwide. Between a mix of confidence and hope was Sivan Rahav Meir, a religious media personality and a leading religious figure in Israel, who spoke with a sense of deep conviction that as hard as things were, they were setting up the stage for a greater understanding of what's to come.
Wow. For sure, I understand it is a meaningful moment, historic moment. I once asked people, try to define what's going on in one word. And people said like unity or, disaster. And one lady said clarity. And I really love that word, clarity. I think these are the days of moral clarity, religious clarity, seriously, days of clarity. In Hebrew, we call it behirut, when something gets brighter and lighter and much more in a way we understand things. These are hard days, challenging days, but there is clarity in the air. Things are much clearer, I think, today than in the past.
And then there were voices like Racheli Frankel, a rabbanit and religious figure of hope and reason and faith, whose son Naftali was kidnapped and murdered by Hamas terrorists in 2014. He was one of the three boys who were kidnapped and evoked immense tefillah, prayer, and fighting for their safe return until it was found out that they were, in fact, murdered. And Racheli spoke about that strange balance that Israelis hold between living life normally and having to go about the day-to-day, and at the same time recognizing that a war in Israel is always personal. I had actually written an article for The Forward, where I'm a contributing columnist, about this idea of trying to understand what it means to grieve with a nation. Where, as the Gemara says, for the mourner, there is always a sword hovering by, reminding the mourner, the person who is in that grief, that death is so close, that we are so mortal.
On a psychological and social level, it's different because human beings are very, creatures of habit, and we get used to everything. So you walk around and, thank God the restaurants are full, people are living their life, and it's weird. It's like you can forget for a second that there is an existential threat and beyond. And then you zoom into that restaurant. And because Israeli society is as it is, so each and every person there, knows maybe a family of kidnapped, several people that lost relatives in the war, maybe a few people that whose children were murdered on October 7th, people who are wounded. Definitely people all over there have relatives in and out of reserve duty. So there's something about like the duality of, because it's been going on for so long, the sense of emergency is kind of, lowered. And thank God life is going on. And, we're all expecting the baby boom. But also in fact, nothing changed. In fact, we're really in the middle of this. And being such a tiny, tiny country, I'm not even sure if people can really understand how small this society is, and how, when you speak about, the different splits and drifts and opinions, and it's all meshed together. It's not like, you're not like the Wikipedia 6 steps away from the next person. You're maybe a step and a half. And you wake up in a bad mood in the morning, it like directly affects your child that might be fighting on the frontier. So how do I feel in this moment in history? I feel that it's a sobering moment.
And then you have people like Rav Yaakov Nagen, a religious Zionist rabbi and an interfaith activist, who spoke about the Jews living in two different modalities. There is one mode that is survival mode, where we are under existential threat and we need to make sure that we will have a future generation, that the Jewish future will not die. And then there is a different mode that is a visionary mode, where it's not just thinking about survival, but it's thinking about building out a future, a dream, an ideal. And for him, he often spoke about balancing those two different modes and how we were once in the visionary mode, but now we have stepped back into the survival mode. But that itself is not particularly unique.
I think for Israelis and Jews throughout the world, October 7th and its aftermath is transformational. True on whether our personal lives and our feelings as part of the Jewish people and part of humanity. Certainly as a Israeli Jew, it's very personal. The pain and trauma are very close. It's students, friends, neighbors who are among the dead and injured. And everything we think about, we have to rethink. In many ways, I felt that in the great story of the Jewish people, we have gone to the, if in the past I would talk about the Jewish people on survival mode, we have now the luxury to go into vision mode, building the great vision of the future of the Jewish people. And October 7th returned us, and certainly me, to realize how fragile the world we live in. And yes, we won't give up on dreaming about the vision of the future, but the survival mode, which was so much a part of the story of the Jewish people throughout the ages, it's back again.
When I think about that more confident sense of okayness, while still managing to recognize the gravity of our situation, I think of Haviv Retzigor, the political analyst from the Times of Israel, who spoke about how Jews and Israelis are okay, and it's really this sense of anxiety and existential fear, which he said is valid, that is making us think that we are really on the brink of destruction. And so he writes about how Israel is heading in strong to defend the Jewish people, that the Jews are strong, and that we will survive our enemies.
We are the strongest Jews who have ever lived in the history of Jews. Obviously, we're okay. We just have this culture of anxiety and tension and worry, but we're okay. We have enemies who think they can destroy us. We have enemies who have set about destroying themselves on the altar of destroying us. That's horrifying and tragic and sad. It's not going to destroy us. We're okay. Every generation of Jews that came before us worked and suffered and bled and to make us, to give us the strength this generation has today. We are so strong that we're actually startled at the fact that there might still be such a thing as war and fear and enemies and big religious ideologies that come for you because you play some role in a big moral historical cartoon running in their own heads. And that surprises us, but that is the basic experience of most generations of Jews at one point or another somewhere. So, welcome to Jewish history. No one has ever been safer and stronger navigating these challenges than this generation. Our one task is to realize that and do whatever we need to do to make our future safer, face down these enemies. There's some way to even cure these enemies of their need to destroy us. But we are emphatically okay.
And then, of course, there are many people for whom, and I think this was across the board regarding of political affiliation, but I do think that people understood this differently and it meant different things to them depending on their political ideology. But what I was about to say is the people who saw October 7th as the culmination of a volatile few years in Israel, in which there were many elections, in which there were the prospects of judicial reform, which to its proponents would rectify a power imbalance between Israel's Supreme Court and the government, and to its opponents saw it as crippling and bludgeoning Israeli democracy and separation of powers. And Yosi Klein Levy, the journalist, author, and fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, was one such person, where for him there was a certain devastation to October 7th, but it came in the context of not feeling trust and comfort with the government leadership.
Unmoored, many of the basic assumptions that I think most Israelis had about Israeli society, security, our place in the region, our relationship with each other in Israeli society, have been upended over the last 2 years. The year before, preceding October 7th, was in some ways the second hardest year in Israeli history. That was the year when many of us felt that the ground under our feet, which was the foundation of Israeliness, which was the consensus around Israel as a Jewish and democratic society, was being pulled apart. And for the first time in the 40 plus years that I've lived in Israel, I felt I couldn't trust my government for the most basic assumptions, that it would uphold the shared Israeli identity of Jewish and democratic, which carried us from left-wing governments to right-wing governments to centrist governments. Suddenly we were in a totally new and uncharted area. And I felt assaulted simultaneously by this coalition of ultras, a coalition of ultra-nationalists, ultra-Orthodox, and ultra-corrupt. And that's before October 7th. And so I felt the ground under me really opening in a way that I've never felt before. And you know, when you live here long enough, you've been through a lot of things. But this was, for me, this was the worst until October 7th, which of course was even worse.
And on the other side, there were people who shared that same sense of fear about leadership in Israel, but not over Israel's political leadership of Netanyahu and the current government in Knesset, but they saw it more in the phrase of Israeli society and in their views with the quote-unquote elites.
I think that for the first time since 1973, most Israelis realize that the existence of the state of Israel is in real and serious danger. And what is unique about this time is that those of us who do not understand this are busy trying to fray the elements of solidarity behind Zionism and behind the Jewish people in general. There is an elite that has a dream of what it sees as progressive normality, and which sees anything Jewish, except maybe the Hebrew language, as a threat to that dream. So in the words of sharp pundit Irit Linur, they are dreaming of a Sweden in Hebrew, and October 7th was a serious setback to that dream. I just did a piece for JNS, and I'm working on a Hebrew version of it. And I find it hard to convey to people that they have been saying that the real enemy is not Hamas, it's Netanyahu and his government. And until you bring the actual quotes, people don't believe you that this is what they're saying. In their view, Hamas is a problem we can deal with. The problem they can't deal with is that they are becoming a demographic minority, and the way they imagine the right is not far from the way liberals in the United States imagine Donald Trump. So fascism, religious fundamentalism, even something approaching Nazism is upon us. And those terrible, deplorable hordes are going to drown their brand of Zionism, the liberal progressive brand of Zionism, which is Sweden in Hebrew, in a tide of backwardness and darkness.
Anita Shapira, a renowned Israeli historian, expressed a similar sentiment.
I'm trying not to feel desperate, but I feel that this is the most difficult moment in Israeli history since the establishment of the state. I think the last 70 years were maybe the most happy years of the Jewish people ever. And now it looks bad. We feel that we are in war after an attack, a vicious attack, and we are governed by a government that doesn't understand what it should do, or it doesn't want to do what it should do, and it's driving the people to desperation.
One thing that I still remember to this day from my interview with Anita Shapira was when she started speaking about the Israelis who were evacuated from the north, which of course, as we're recording right now on October 2nd, and Israel is fighting Hezbollah and Iran for many reasons, but at least most prominently to return the tens of thousands who were, maybe the hundreds of thousands, I'm actually not sure, who were evacuated from the north because of the threat of rockets and the threat of a Hezbollah attack similar to October 7th. And when I was interviewing her, I saw her eyes welling up with tears, and I really did sense like a deep sadness over that situation. And I asked her to elaborate about it. And here's what she said.
Today, we are facing an existential struggle, and we are facing it while we are divided, while we are incapable of taking rational decisions because of a minority that is governing the prime minister. And as a result of that, we cannot make the decision to finish the war in Gaza. We cannot make the decision to get back the abducted Jews. We cannot get the dead Jews. And the result is that we cannot finish the war in Gaza, and we cannot take care of other borders. I never faced a situation in which the government of Israel decided to evacuate a whole area of Israel. And this government, because of panic, because of not knowing what to do, evacuated the north, which never happened before. And we had attacks. We had infiltrations. We had people killed. But we never had this anti-moral decision to evacuate an area, a whole area, and to keep the people everywhere but not in their homes. And the result was that the Hezbollah feels entitled to bomb and destroy settlements that was settled more than 100 years ago, at the beginning and before the beginning of the 20th century. This is unbelievable. This is something that never happened before. And we are facing many dangers. And we don't have the kind of government that we should have in such a time. A unity government that the best people rule the country and enlist the best people outside the government to help them. Right now, we don't do that.
And that sense of bleakness was echoed elsewhere by people like Benny Morris, another famed Israeli historian.
Well, I'm quite despondent. Things have taken a very bad turn, I would say, over the past 2 decades, but certainly over the past year and a half, with October 7th being, of course, the high point for despondency. Well, Netanyahu, returning to power a year and a half ago, tried to overthrow the Israeli democratic system by lessening the power or reducing completely the power of the judiciary and essentially taking power into his own hands and that of his coalition members, but basically it's in his own hands. And this was followed, of course, by October 7th, which means that he diverted people's attention, the bureaucracy's attention, the army's attention away from our outside neighbors onto something which was completely absurd. And this led to the big surprise and in part to the IDF's incompetence on October 7th, 8th.
And others like editor-in-chief of the Times of Israel, David Harvit.
Wow, pretty bleak. People have lived here longer than I have. I've lived here for 2/3 of my life. That is about 40 years. This is the worst period that I've lived through. And I don't think it's ridiculous to believe that it's the hardest period in the modern history of the state. We are surrounded by extremely uncompromising and unfortunately capable enemies who have inflicted incredible harm on this country. And we're terribly riven from within. And we need to make sure this state survives and thrives. Also because of what's going on for Jewish people around the world who are going through, a terrible period of rising anti-Semitism, things that I didn't expect to see in my lifetime. So this is a pretty awful period. And you have to hope that we will find the wisdom and the resilience and the common ground from within to get through this.
But I think that despite all of this, there is in general a shared belief, one of the Ikarei HaEmunah, foundational principles of faith, you might say, that Jews and Israelis share that almost seems as if it's bound up, it's wrapped up in what it means to be a Jew, what it means to be someone living with thousands of years of resilience of survival against persecution and genocide and enslavement. And I think this was captured by Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer, where he talks about the optimism that he's filled with, looking at Israel, looking at the Jewish people, rising up against all the odds, together as one, almost entirely as one, willing to do what needs to be done to ensure our safety and our survival.
I think this is an incredible moment in Israeli history. It's a moment that brings back 1948, the inception of the State of Israel, which of course entirely changed the landscape of the Jewish world, what it means to be Jewish. And I think it's a moment like that when I look around and I see the Israeli youth, that we were skeptical concerning whether they would show up for this war, the TikTok generation, and see their incredible self-sacrifice, their incredible building from within of something new in Israel. It fills me with optimism. Of course, I share the deep concerns that the Israeli society is surrounded by enemies and, of course, a lot of tension from within. But at the same time, I'm filled with optimism. I think it's a real moment for the future of Israel and the Jewish people.
So you're probably not used to hearing me that much because in general, as I said before, 18 Questions, 40 Israeli Thinkers is about platforming the Israeli voices, the Israeli thinkers, the leading Israeli voices. And I think in an interesting note, a lot of this year for me as a new Ole has been trying to figure out my voice and trying to bridge the gap and the distance between myself as a new immigrant with the yawning gap with the native-born Israelis. I've written a lot about that in the foreword, so you're welcome to check that out. And in all of those articles, I really do try not to center myself and make myself the focus, but to use my experience as a lens to better understand and connect with Israelis who do live in a very different reality, in a very different state of being than Jews who weren't born in Israel and Jews who don't live in Israel. And so I guess I'll end this podcast, or this episode of the podcast, that I hope this does in some way allow you to feel October 7th in a way that drives us toward action, that drives us toward resolution, and that drives us toward the safety, the return of the hostages, the protection of our chayalim, and the future for Israel, the Jewish people, and the world. When, as Yeshaya says, "V'shafat bein hagoyim v'ochiach la'amim rabim, v'chitzu charvosam le'itim, v'chanisosehem lemazmerot, lo yisa goy el goy cherev, v'lo yilmedu od milchama." And God will be the judge for all the nations, and he will decide among the peoples, and everyone will beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into hooks, and no longer will nations raise their swords against one another, and they will never need to teach each other war. May we live in a world that we never again understand October 7th, or a horror such as this.